Sketches of Life. The Man Who Only Eats Hors d'oeuvres. Scene begins in a hotel ballroom. Our main character, Steve, is wearing a nice suit and standing and talking business with a few other people at a cocktail party. A bunch of very successful, well-dressed, wealthy individuals are all having a good time. Steve is a regular-looking businessman, dressed very, very well. As he socializes, waiters bring around food on trays with cocktail napkins. Plenty of hors d'oeuvres for everybody to partake. After the scene is established, it becomes clear that people are beginning to leave. One partygoer says, "Yeah, if we could only have it as good as Steve over here," and pats Steve on the back. They have some buffoonish, smug but endearing laughter, and people begin to clear out. Steve and his very attractive girlfriend gradually make their way towards the exit. Next scene takes place outside the hotel where Steve and his girlfriend are walking along a Chicago sidewalk. They're in a very nice neighborhood full of fancy hotels, high-rise condos, and upscale restaurants. They reach a traffic light and wait for the sign to walk. Girlfriend says to Steve, "You sure do know a lot of interesting people." Steve laughs a smarmy laugh, gives her a kiss on the cheek, and reaches his arm around her shoulders. As they're waiting, a waiter approaches Steve with a tray and cocktail napkins. Steve grabs an hors d'oeuvre and thanks the waiter, who then politely walks away. Seconds later, they receive the walk sign and proceed to cross the street on their way home. Next scene is in Steve's apartment. Steve and his girlfriend are lying in bed after having made love. After a long, pleased sigh, Steve puts his arm around his girlfriend, and a waiter comes to his bedside holding a tray and cocktail napkins. He leans forward for Steve to grab something. Steve takes an hors d'oeuvre, thanks the waiter, who then leaves. Next scene is in Steve's office. Steve is working in a nice high-rise office overlooking Lake Michigan and other downtown sites. He is typing away on his computer. Eventually, he stops and stares at his screen, trying to solve a problem. A few seconds after this, a waiter comes by with another tray full of hors d'oeuvres and cocktail napkins. Steve takes one, thanks the waiter, who then walks away. After consuming the hors d'oeuvre, something seems to click. Steve has a expression of recognition on his face and goes back to typing away. The next scene, Steve is at his upscale health club lifting weights. He's doing a bench press. Exerting himself, he finishes the set slowly and then sits up. He has a towel nearby. He sits on the bench where he was doing his lifts, wipes some sweat from his brow, and takes a few deep breaths. Within seconds, a waiter comes by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Steve grabs one and a cocktail napkin, thanks the waiter, who then leaves. Steve chews with satisfaction, then says to himself, "Better not go swimming right away." Next scene, Steve is waiting on the street to hail a cab. He has his hand out, and from the other direction, a waiter comes up with a tray and a napkin. Just before the cab arrives, the waiter's tray is at Steve's grasp. He takes another hors d'oeuvre, thanks the waiter, who then finishes. Steve gets in the cab, and the car pulls away. Next scene takes place at a sporting goods store. Steve is browsing the aisles, looking at running shoes and then perhaps some golf clubs. The scene lingers. He continues to look around. He walks down towards the end of an aisle and looks both directions to see if anybody is coming his way. He walks a little bit more. Nobody's coming around. An employee sees him and approaches him. "Can I help you, sir?" Steve says, "Are you out of spring rolls?" The employee says, "You mean foam rolls for your back?" Steve then asks, "Chicken wings?" "What are you talking about?" the employee says. Steve smiles as if to apologize, then continues to look around, scared. He hurries towards the exit. Just outside the sporting goods store, Steve exits hurriedly, and as soon as he's outside, he looks around in every direction. There's no waiter in sight. His fear deepens. He's getting more and more frantic. We cut to a different part of town, and Steve is approaching another intersection. It looks like he's been walking around for a while, looking and not finding any waiters carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. He begins to curse himself. We cut to another part of town, and Steve is now desperately looking around for cocktail waiters. Nobody comes. He eventually sits on a park bench and seems to be regrouping, asking himself what he's going to do next. Scene cuts to a grocery store. Steve is wandering the aisles of the grocery store, looking around at particular food items and wondering if they constitute the ingredients needed to make hors d'oeuvres. He puts a handful of things in his tray. He clearly looks completely out of sorts and not in his element. Cut to the following scene inside Steve's apartment in his kitchen. He has a cookbook in front of him and he is trying very incompetently to make crab cakes. He fumbles around with the ingredients. He pulls a tray from the oven and they are all burnt. Scene next cuts to a fancy hotel, the same hotel at the beginning of the sketch. Steve is wearing a suit but now looks a little bit more rumpled. The tie is loosened, the cuffs are unbuttoned, perhaps the shoes untied. He sees that there is a wedding reception taking place in the same ballroom where he was attending a party earlier. He moves furtively through the lobby, trying to go unnoticed. A hotel security guard spots him as he's making his way towards the entrance to the ballroom. He inconspicuously tries to enter the ballroom, but the security guard continues to pursue. After a few seconds, a waiter is passing by with some kebab sticks on a tray. Steve reaches out a hand to grab some. However, he's halted by the security guard, who grabs his hand and then says, "Do you have an invitation, sir?" "Invitation? Oh, yeah, hang on a second, I got it somewhere," Steve says, and then he pretends to look through his coat pocket, doesn't find anything, and very suddenly he grabs 3 kebab sticks off the tray and runs as fast as he can for the exit while shoving them into his mouth. The security guard gives chase, but after a couple of seconds decides not to pursue when it's clear that Steve has run and is not coming back. Scene cuts to a city sidewalk. Steve is again wandering the neighborhood near his apartment, now looking like a defeated and broken person. He passes by a park and settles on a park bench, sitting down and sighing. He may as well be a homeless man at this point. He quietly begins to sob and puts his hands in his face. After a few seconds, a man nearby loudly clears his throat. Steve looks up and sees a waiter holding a tray of shrimp with toothpicks in them. "My apologies, sir. Our shrimp delivery was delayed." "You're out of shrimp?" Steve asks. "Not anymore," the waiter says, smiling. Steve gets up, takes a couple from the tray, consumes them greedily, and they both part ways. The scene then cuts to Steve's apartment building. In the lobby, Steve is coming in from the cold. He sees a waiter standing near the elevator, holding a tray. He grabs an egg roll and a cocktail napkin, thanks the waiter, gets on the elevator, and goes up to his unit. And scene. Brief notes. It should be clear that nobody seems to find anything unusual about Steve being served hors d'oeuvres outside of a ballroom setting. The waiter should always be dressed in formal wear as well. Recorded May 5th, 2013.